Hello and welcome to Byju's IAS. Before we take up today's The Hindu analysis, we have a small announcement. Beginning from the 4th of September, we shall be launching our much awaited prelims crash course, which is designed to help those aspirants who are appearing for this year's prelims scheduled to be held by the UPSC in the month of October. This crash course will be held daily from the 4th of September till the 25th of September, and these classes shall be live on our YouTube channel between 7:30 p.m. to 9:30 p.m. In this crash course, we shall focus on the current affairs developments of the last 1 year, and through relevant practice MCQs, we shall cover a wide variety of subjects including polity, economics, international relations, science and tech, environment and ecology, and as well as government schemes and reports. So we hope you make use of this initiative and don't forget to share this information with fellow aspirants and to hit the subscribe button. So with this, let's get started with the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper by looking at a column from page number 7 of the Delhi edition. This column is written by Mr. Rajiv Bhatia, a former Indian diplomat, and he evaluates the BRICS grouping in detail. See, the BRICS is a multilateral grouping of 5 countries, that is Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Today it is seen as a major grouping of 5 emerging economies, and the initial idea of this grouping was laid down in 2001 when the then chairman of Goldman Sachs, Jim O'Neill, coined the term BRIC. He referred to these 4 emerging economies, that is Brazil, Russia, India, and China, of having the potential to dominate the world and to counter the traditional influence of the West. This idea eventually led to a meeting in 2006 between the foreign ministers of these 4 countries on the sidelines of the UNGA meeting at New York. Then came the global financial crisis of 2008-2009, which pushed the world into a global recession, and the emerging economies of BRIC, they largely held the Western countries responsible, especially the United States, for this financial crisis. This led these 4 countries to come together and form a grouping to primarily challenge the domination of the West in key financial institutions. So in 2009, the first formal summit of BRIC grouping was held at Yekaterinburg in Russia, thus formally giving birth to the BRIC grouping. Then the next year, in 2010, the BRIC became the BRICS with the addition of South Africa as a new member. Strategic experts have always felt that this grouping has great potential and great significance because these 5 emerging economies, they not only represent 4 different continents, but they also represent 42% of the global population, 30% of the global land area, 24% of the global GDP, and 16% of international trade. Over the years, these 5 countries have invested significant political capital into this grouping, and they have held frequent summits and interactions in order to take forward this initiative. So, the primary agenda of this grouping was to focus on multilateralism and to promote the rise of a multilateral world against a unipolar world which was largely dominated by the Western countries, especially by the United States. The agenda of BRICS has been to build a counter dominance against the dominance of the West, beginning with key financial institutions such as the World Bank and the IMF. The Bretton Woods institutions, or the World Bank and the IMF, have been traditionally dominated by the West, that is, by the US and the European countries. If the World Bank is dominated by the US, the IMF has largely been dominated by the European Union. The BRICS members have always considered that these institutions have been stuck in the World War era and they do not reflect the current economic or current geopolitical realities. The Western countries have always retained a higher voting share at the World Bank and the IMF, which has often worked to the disadvantage of the BRICS members. So, as the BRICS economies had emerged, they tried pushing for reforms at the World Bank and the IMF in order to champion the principle of multilateralism and to build a counter dominance against the traditional dominance of the West. As a result of this agenda, the BRICS grouping has achieved considerable progress over the years, and it even managed to establish counter institutions to the World Bank and the IMF when it decided to set up the New Development Bank or the NDB at the Fortaleza summit. The BRICS members have even set up the contingent reserve arrangement as a counter to the IMF. Then, over the years, this grouping has diversified into several other sectors as well, and it has not been limited just to the global economy and financial matters. The BRICS members have been working on their developmental challenges, and the COVID-19 pandemic in particular has brought them closer, and they are even looking to set up a vaccine research and development virtual center. So, next month, on the 9th of September, the 13th summit of BRICS is all set to take place, and India would be hosting this summit as India currently holds the chair of the BRICS grouping. So, in the run up to the 13th summit, India has laid down four key priorities for the grouping, with the first priority being multilateral reforms at key multilateral institutions such as the World Bank, the IMF, the United Nations, the World Trade Organization, and even the World Health Organization, which has been facing a lot of criticism following its poor handling of the pandemic. Traditionally, these multilateral institutions have been dominated by the West, that is, by the US and the European countries, and India wants to push for reforms at these organizations with the support of the BRICS grouping in order to push for reforms at these institutions and make them relevant in today's world. The second priority area identified by India is counterterrorism and the current situation in Afghanistan. Over the last few years, the BRICS members have been focused on counterterrorism initiatives, and even though China's strategic nexus with Pakistan has led to the shielding of Pakistan as a state sponsor of terrorism, China hasn't hesitated to speak against terrorism and take concrete steps with the other BRICS members because China itself is a victim of terrorism, especially in its Xinjiang province, where terror groups such as the ETIM or the East Turkestan Islamic Movement have connections with other terror outfits of the Afghanistan Pakistan belt, including the Al Qaeda, the Taliban, and the others. So, BRICS members have been coming together to launch a counterterrorism initiative, and most likely at this summit, which is being hosted by India, the BRICS Counterterrorism Action Plan is likely to be launched, which will focus on de radicalization, countering terror financing, and tackling the misuse of the internet and social media platforms by terrorist outfits. Then India is also prioritizing the deployment of digital solutions to help the member countries achieve their sustainable development goal targets. India is seen to be at the forefront of developing and deploying technological solutions and digital solutions to improve governance and to achieve socio-economic objectives. And hence, this is yet another priority area to drive the BRICS members to achieve their SDG targets. Then the fourth priority laid down by India is the promotion of people to people relations in order to promote cultural ties between the BRICS members and to leverage soft power to take this grouping forward. So overall, the BRICS grouping has seen its share of success and it is proactively working on several priority areas. But however, it has been facing several challenges and hurdles as well. In fact, there have been several experts who have dismissed the BRICS grouping as a prominent grouping, mainly on the basis of internal differences within the BRICS grouping. Because, see, politically, the BRICS members are very different. Russia and China are authoritative communist states, whereas Brazil, India, and South Africa happen to be functioning democracies. Then, upon that, within the BRICS grouping, the constant tensions between India and China has affected unity within the grouping, and especially the latest round of border tensions, which we have been witnessing along the line of actual control since last year, has had an impact on the solidarity of the BRICS grouping. This, accompanied with China's economic rise and strategic and military aggression, especially across the Indo-Pacific region, creates internal challenges for the BRICS grouping, and it has emerged as a major concern. Then upon that, China's strategic rivalry with the West has gone up in the recent years, followed by the ongoing Cold War between US and China. These global geopolitical divides further weaken the BRICS grouping internally, and other members such as Brazil and South Africa, they have been busy dealing with their own internal problems, including their economic crisis and social crisis. So, in this context, the writer says that the BRICS has performed quite well. It has seen its share of success and achievements despite all the differences. But if the member countries do not overcome the current challenges and hurdles, then they won't be able to shape the grouping into one of the most prominent groupings in the world. For this to happen, the members have to set aside their internal differences, and especially China will have to tone down its agenda of global domination. It is only through such internal consensus that the BRICS members can focus on trade and investment, because there is an urgent need to not only boost their trade volumes within the group, but they will also have to work on strengthening the supply chains and focus on further diversifying their economic relations into other sectors such as agriculture, disaster resilience, digital health, traditional medicine, customs cooperation, etc. Then finally, the BRICS members have forgotten one of their initial commitments to extend support to the Global South. The term Global South in this context refers to the developing and underdeveloped nations, and the BRICS countries were supposed to provide leadership to the South countries. In this regard, the BRICS members haven't done enough, and if they truly wish to challenge the West and the domination of the United States, then they need to extend further diplomatic support and maybe even economic support to the Global South, so that the agenda of the developing and underdeveloped nations can be brought to the forefront, especially at these multilateral institutions, which will create the right platform for pushing reforms at these institutions. So, in conclusion, the writer says that the grouping has succeeded up to a point, but now the time has come to overcome the multiple challenges that confronts the organization and to envision and build a better BRICS grouping. Now let's take up another column from page number 7 that deals with the topic of community-led development and community-led conservation. This column essentially deals with the topic of sustainable development and efficient and environment-friendly natural resource management. See, in the field of environment conservation and protection, and in the field of sustainable development, it's a well-established fact that community-led involvement, community-led development, based on traditional practices and indigenous knowledge, is always one of the most effective and efficient ways of managing natural resources. These principles are seen as the key mantras in resource utilization and resource management, especially when you have to balance them with environmental considerations. Here, the writers take the example of Meghalaya and how unsustainable exploitation was destroying the natural resources of the state. See, Meghalaya is known as one of the wettest places in India, and many locations in the state receive record rainfall. But despite this, many regions in the state have been facing water scarcity. This is a direct result of unsustainable exploitation and poor government intervention. See, generally, such sustainable conservation practices are a part of tribal societies such as Meghalaya. Tribal societies and ethnic societies are known for their community participation and for their traditional and indigenous practices and knowledge, which is based on the foundation of sustainable exploitation and usage of natural resources. But unfortunately, this community involvement, the community leadership, and traditional practices and indigenous knowledge has not been passed on to the current generations, which has resulted in a knowledge gap or a knowledge barrier. Because generally, such traditional knowledge and indigenous practices were transferred from one generation to another, but today, modern development and the lack of access to such knowledge and unsustainable exploitation and the poor role of the government has disturbed the flow of this traditional knowledge to the current generations. Hence, to address the current problems in natural resource management, the state government has decided to prioritize community participation and to enable the free flow of traditional indigenous knowledge. For this purpose, the Meghalaya government has launched a project known as the Meghalaya Community-Led Landscape Management Project. This project is funded by the World Bank, and through this initiative, the state government is looking to create grassroots community facilitators who will take leadership roles with regard to natural resource management of the local areas. Under this initiative, the government is leveraging digital tools and digital infrastructure to enable the free flow of knowledge and information, and it is channelizing resources, especially financial resources and even technical resources and capacity building through government flagship programs such as Manrega, and it is also seen to be promoting convergence amongst all relevant government departments. Through these outreach programs, the government is focusing on the local youth to educate them and train them and enable them to become community facilitators. By making use of digital apps, the government is looking to build a local leadership community of 14 to 18,000 villages by providing them the adequate resources to gain traditional knowledge and indigenous knowledge in order to solve the problem of access to this traditional information. Parallelly, the government will also provide for training and capacity building, and by acting as an enabler, it is looking to promote community leadership and community ownership. This will allow the local youth, in the form of community facilitators, to devise local solutions for local problems and to more efficiently manage their own natural resources by providing for sustainable usage, by keeping in mind the concerns of environment protection and biodiversity conservation. So, in conclusion, such community led participation in natural resource management based on traditional indigenous knowledge is said to be one of the most effective methods with regard to sustainable natural resource management. Now, let's take up an editorial from page number 6 that deals with Pakistan's ties with the Taliban. See, after the Taliban overran Kabul and captured Afghanistan, Pakistan was one of the very few countries in the world which welcomed the Taliban takeover in the country. Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan wholeheartedly welcomed the Taliban's capture of Kabul. And recently, when the American troops finally quit Afghanistan, Prime Minister Imran Khan even claimed that Afghans had broken the shackles of slavery. So, this is a clear indication that Pakistan backs a Taliban government in Afghanistan. Now, this doesn't come as a surprise because Pakistan has a history of supporting the Taliban. Back in the 1990s, it was Pakistan's intelligence agency, the ISI, which nurtured the creation of this radical outfit known as the Taliban out of the remnants of the Afghan Mujahideen. Later in 1996, when the Taliban captured power and established an Islamic Emirate government in Afghanistan, Pakistan became one of the three countries which gave recognition to the Talibani government. Along with Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, it was only Pakistan which had official ties with the then Taliban government. Then even after 2001, that is even after the Taliban government was overthrown by the US forces, Pakistan's intelligence agency, the ISI, sheltered the top leadership of Taliban at Quetta, the capital of Balochistan province, and formed the Quetta Shura or the Quetta Council, which became the de facto leadership of the Taliban. Then between 2001 until the recent takeover of Taliban, Pakistan kept nurturing the Talibani leadership by protecting them inside Pakistan and by directly enabling their regrouping and resurgence, which allowed them to stage their insurgent war against the US, which eventually drew out the US, along with all the foreign troops from Afghanistan. So, to understand this complex strategy of Pakistan, we need to look at its rivalry with India. Pakistan has always seen Afghanistan as a part of its strategic depth concept. As a part of its intense rivalry with India, Pakistan has always desired strategic depth in Afghanistan, where it has always sought to ensure that the country is unstable, which in turn could create a fertile ground for Pakistan's proxies, such as the Lashkar-e-Toiba, the Jaish-e-Mohammed, and other radical terror outfits, which could be supported and nurtured by other radical groups like the Taliban and the Al-Qaeda, which again have been backed by the Pakistani state. This is seen as a part of Pakistan's covert war against India, and it has always resisted a stable Afghanistan, especially under a civilian government, which was backed by US and India. But the editorial cautions Pakistan about this devious strategy, and it warns Pakistan to not celebrate the victory that its proxy Taliban has registered in neighboring Afghanistan. Because at the end of the day, the Taliban is a fundamentalist outfit, and most likely, several radical Sunni jihadist outfits are likely to thrive in Afghanistan, especially along the Af-Pak border. And this also includes the Pakistan branch of the Taliban known as the TTP or the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan. This terror outfit is known to target the Pakistani state itself, and such terror groups pose a credible threat to the very existence of the Pakistani state. So the editorial says that Pakistan needs to learn lessons from the American experience. The United States meddled in Afghanistan back in the 1980s as a part of its Cold War rivalry with the Soviet Union. After the Soviet Union occupied Afghanistan in 1979 in order to support a communist government in Afghanistan, the US saw this as an opportunity to hit back against the Soviet Union and launched a covert proxy war by working with Pakistan and Saudi Arabia. The Americans funded the creation of the Afghan Mujahideen, which was trained and equipped by Pakistan with direct backing and support of the US and Saudi Arabia. Eventually, by 1989, the Afghan Mujahideen drew out the Soviet forces. But eventually, it was the remnants of the Afghan Mujahideen who would later form the Taliban in the 1990s and even capture power in the country and then shelter terrorist outfits like the Al Qaeda, which hit back at the United States by carrying out the devastating 9/11 attacks. So, back in the 1980s, when the US was waging this covert proxy war against the Soviet Union by using Afghan soil, it would have never imagined the blowback and the consequences of this covert war. Because the 9/11 attacks was simply the deadliest attacks the US had witnessed since the Second World War, and it eventually dragged the US into a full blown out war in Afghanistan against the Taliban in its hunt of the Al Qaeda terrorists. 20 years after this conflict, the US has exited Afghanistan after losing the conflict, and these bitter lessons learned by the US should serve as a warning to Pakistan as well. Because according to the editorial, there are great dangers involved in such covert proxy wars, and when a state agency is involved in promoting radicalism and fundamentalism, chances are very high that these terror outfits, which are being nurtured today, could come back to strike against the sponsoring country itself. Hence, the editorial concludes by stating that religious extremism and militancy in Afghanistan will be counterproductive for Pakistan in the long run. Next, we have a related article on page number 1. The UN Security Council has adopted resolution number 2593 on the current situation in Afghanistan. This resolution was sponsored by India as the president of the UN Security Council, and it has been adopted by the UN Security Council as India's presidency was coming to an end. Interestingly, Russia and China have abstained from adopting this resolution, whereas India has said that through this resolution, all the key concerns with regard to Taliban's takeover of Afghanistan have been addressed. This resolution, sponsored by India, was backed by US, UK, France, and several other members of the UN Security Council. Under its key provisions, the UN has mandated the Taliban to ensure that terrorist outfits, especially those terrorists who have been sanctioned under the UNSC 1267 committee, are not given a ground in Afghanistan to continue their acts of terrorism in the region and beyond. The Taliban has also been mandated to ensure that there are no safe sanctuaries or safe havens created for these terrorist outfits. And it also places an obligation on the Taliban to ensure the safe evacuation of all foreign nationals and even Afghan nationals, especially the minorities, if they seek to leave Afghanistan. But this resolution has not been supported by China and Russia, and they abstained from its adoption because, according to China, the exclusion of the Uyghur terrorist outfit known as ETIM or the East Turkestan Islamic Movement is unfair as it provides for the inclusion of other terror groups and terrorists listed under the 1267 Sanctions Committee. China's argument is that terrorists belonging to Al Qaeda, Lashkar-e-Toiba, Jaish-e-Mohammed, and the others have been brought under this resolution, but ETIM has been excluded, which is a threat for China. Then both Russia and China have felt that this resolution, sponsored by India and supported by US, UK, and France, was rushed through the Security Council and it is not a balanced resolution. Next, in a landmark development that has been reported in this article on page number 9, for the first time, India has officially held talks with the Taliban leadership. This interaction took place at Doha, the capital of Qatar, where the Indian ambassador to Qatar has met with a senior leader of the Taliban. This marks India's first ever official interaction with the Taliban leadership, and the Indian ambassador met with the head of Taliban's political office, Sher Mohammad Abbas Tankazi. This Taliban leader is reportedly known for his connections with India because he was trained at the Indian Military Academy in Dehradun as a part of India's military assistance to Afghanistan. So for a long time, he has been an asset of India in Afghanistan, and through him, the Talibani leadership has reached out to India, and for the first time ever, India has held official interactions with the Taliban leadership. This landmark decision of India to directly engage with the Taliban comes after heavy criticism against the Indian government, as it failed to protect its interests in Afghanistan, including its investments, by holding back on the decision to engage with the Taliban for years together. As the US Taliban talks had begun few years back, many governments around the world they reached out to the Taliban and they struck their own deals in order to protect their core interests. But India always held back, and only few unofficial interactions were reported, but there was never any official interaction between India and Taliban. India's main fear was driven by the fact that Taliban is a puppet of Pakistan's ISI, and it was also based on the fact that India had branded the Taliban as a terrorist outfit. But this idealistic policy of India was seen as a short-sighted policy by strategic experts, and they were calling upon India to adopt a more realistic, pragmatic policy. Because even back in the 1990s, when the Afghan Mujahideen and later Taliban, when they gained control of Afghanistan, India had reached out to several leaders, including the likes of Burhanuddin Rabbani, Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, who were all part of the Afghan Mujahideen movement. India had even built contacts with General Dostum and Ahmad Shah Massoud, who were also part of the Afghan resistance against the Soviet Union. And later, India had even backed the Northern Alliance, led by Ahmad Shah Massoud, with the support of other tribal warlords and leaders like General Dostum. So back in the 1990s, India was known to maintain official and unofficial contacts with members of the Afghan Mujahideen and the Taliban, and as well as members of the Northern Alliance, in order to protect its core strategic interests. But currently, as the crisis emerged, India failed to reach out to Taliban officially over the last few years, and it was only reported that unofficial contacts had happened, but this wasn't sufficient to protect Indian interests. Now, following the latest escalation in the crisis, India has finally reached out to the Taliban leadership through one of its assets, and this shows that the Taliban is looking to reach out to India as well in order to seek recognition and legitimacy. So during this meeting between the Indian ambassador and the Taliban leader, India has placed a few demands in front of the Taliban. India wants the Taliban to ensure that Afghanistan doesn't become a sanctuary of terrorist outfits, especially those which target India. And India also wants to ensure a complete safe evacuation of all its nationals, along with Afghan nationals, especially the minority Hindus and Sikhs. So such an outreach by India is set to help India to protect its interests, especially to keep away Pakistan's proxies like the Haqqani network, the Lashkar-e-Toiba and the Jaish-e-Mohammed. But it still needs to be seen whether India will go ahead and give formal diplomatic recognition to a future Taliban government in the country. Then parallelly, another concern which has emerged is what happens with regard to Afghanistan's membership of the SAARC grouping. The South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation has 8 South Asian members, including India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Maldives, Nepal, Bhutan, and Afghanistan. But now that Taliban has toppled the Afghan government and captured power, and since the members of SAARC, except for Pakistan, are yet to recognize the Taliban government, a conflicting question has emerged for the SAARC members as to what will happen for Afghanistan's membership in the SAARC grouping. See, Afghanistan was admitted to SARC only in 2007 at India's insistence, as a mark of India's growing diplomatic relations with the Afghan civilian government. Since then, Afghanistan has been a key member of the SARC grouping and it has always backed Indian initiatives. But now, with the recent changes in Afghanistan, it needs to be seen as to what role Afghanistan will play in the SARC grouping. Now, let's look at the mains practice questions. The first question: the BRICS grouping was seen as a success up to a point, but now it confronts multiple challenges. Examine the statement and offer suggestions to make the grouping better. The second question: how can traditional practices and community involvement promote sustainable use of natural resources? Illustrate with an example. Kindly write an answer to these questions and post your answers in the answer writing portal, for which the link shall be shared in the description box below. So with this, let's conclude our discussion for today. Thanks for watching.